question, when did the Transfiguration happen? So this is partly to do with where Luke puts it, but it's also to do with where it falls in Jesus' ministry. Secondly, what actually happened at the Transfiguration. So we're going to look at some of the meaning behind it and some of the actual events of it. And then lastly, why did the Transfiguration happen? So when, what, and why? Okay, when did it take place? It's in Luke chapter 9, it's in other Gospels as well, but Luke is our Gospel for the year, as you know. Prior to Luke chapter 9, so all of Jesus' work up until now, he's been in sort of modern day language, establishing his brand. He's been doing things that lots of people have spotted. He's been doing things to get noticed, because if he didn't do that, then he's got nobody to talk to. So nearly all the miracles that are in Luke's Gospel are in the bit up to Luke chapter 9. There are only 2, possibly 3 afterwards. So lots of miracles, lots of healing, nature miracles, those sorts of things. Things that get him noticed. He's sort of putting himself out there so that people see and come and listen to him. At the same time, he's gathering people around him, so not just sort of crowds who come and listen and take notice to what he's saying. He's called his 12 disciples, so the people who are particularly close to him, but also other groups of people who are going to be sent out to do things. So he's establishing himself as a preacher and as a teacher and as something different, as his miracles would show. He's establishing his brand, he's putting himself out there. After Luke chapter 9, so after this chapter that we're looking at now, and indeed within it, he now sets his face towards Jerusalem. Now that doesn't mean to say that Luke chapter 10 is Good Friday. We've got a long way to go. Between Luke chapter 9 and Good Friday and Holy Week and so forth, there is an enormous amount of teaching. That's nearly all the parables that Luke gives us, and Luke gives us parable after parable after parable, come in this second bit. It's as though Jesus is thinking, I haven't got long with these people. I need to teach them, I need to teach them, I need to teach them, so that they know more and more. So Luke chapter 9 is a bit of a turning point. It's a bit of a time when things change. Up until then, it's as though he's the sort of popular, come and see me. The advertising hoardings would all be saying, have you seen Jesus? The social media would be, things would be flying around saying, I've heard of this wonderful person, why don't you go and see him? And he's gathering around his group of people. Luke chapter 9 is really important. Luke chapter 9 includes in it the confession by Peter that Jesus is the Christ. So at Caesarea Philippi, when Jesus says to his disciples, who do people say that I am? And Peter says, you are the Christ. So for all his miracles and all his gathering people around, in Luke chapter 9, Jesus knows for the first time that the penny is beginning to drop with at least one person, that the message is getting through, that he's not just some sort of magician who can make things better, that actually he is an important person and he comes from God. And he knows that because Peter has said that. So Luke chapter 9, Jesus can think, yes, something's gone in. I'm making some progress. Somebody, at least one person, is beginning to understand who I am, although Peter's next words showed that his understanding was really very superficial. And it's within that context that we then have the Transfiguration. So it's as though it's a sort of pinnacle, it's a sort of height, or maybe it's a false peak, I'm not entirely sure. So that from the beginning of Luke, we're going up and up and up as more and more people know about Jesus. Then we get to Luke chapter 9 and we get to this point where Peter says, you are the Christ, and Jesus can think people are beginning to understand. Then we have the Transfiguration, and we're going to look at what that meant. And from that point on, he looks towards Jerusalem. And he mentions it twice, I think, in Luke chapter 9, that his time is limited and that he is here to die. And he makes that conscious decision to turn and to move towards Jerusalem, knowing exactly what that would mean. So it falls within, that's the sort of context which it falls, of telling people all about him and then actually moving on to the ultimate mission that he came to do. So when did it happen? That's the context in which it happened. The next thing we need to look at, I've got a clicker this today. It's such fun. I can do this backwards and forwards. It's just amazing. Perhaps we'll go back and sing something else. I could click it back. We'll sing that one again. It was so good. We'll do it again. So that's when it happened. What happened? What happened at the Transfiguration? So I suspect that we know the story, that Jesus goes up a mountain and he's got his 3 close disciples with him. Elijah and Moses appear with him. As I said at the 9 o'clock service, it's always baffled me as to how they knew it was Moses and Elijah. It's a complete mystery to me. Maybe that's a small miracle in itself. It's not as though we're in today, we would have photographs around, wouldn't we, of great leaders and so forth. So they had no idea. And Jesus knew who they were. Maybe that's not so surprising. Peter knew who they were. We think, did they have a name badge? I'm Moses or something like that. I don't know. Anyway, they did know. And they appear, and a cloud comes, and there's a voice, and then it's over, and Moses and Elijah goes. Okay. The symbolism behind the Transfiguration is immense. There is so much that the Transfiguration is telling us, but we need to peel back the layers. And I'm really only going to scratch the surface with you today. Maybe after today you'd like to go home. If you've got a commentary, you could look at that, go onto the internet and just put in Transfiguration, what does it mean? And just peel away some of the things there. Because it's one of these things that we can't fully get to grips with without a really quite good understanding of parts of the Old Testament, and we would be here until Tuesday and our pancakes if we did all of it in detail today. But let's just have a look at some of it. Symbolism. The first pair of symbols, as it were, the mountain and the cloud. The mountain and the cloud. We need to cast our minds back to start with to Mount Sinai and the people walking through the desert. They've been taken out of Egypt where they were treated so badly, and now they're on their way to the promised land, but it's going to take a long time for them to get there. On the way, Moses, who's leading them, is called by God to go up the mountain in order to meet with God. The mountain is where God is. Again, I said at the 9 o'clock service, that for some people, they see a mountain as being the place to meet God because it's between earth, where we are, and heaven, where God is. I'm not absolutely convinced myself by that symbolism, but you might find that helpful. But the idea that God, the meeting point for God at that time, is on a mountain because it's been God and humans. But regardless of that, the mountain is where God is. That for Moses, he goes up Mount Sinai, and that's where God is. And how does he know? How does God make his presence known? God does it through a cloud. He says to Moses, I am going to come and speak to you in the cloud. And so a cloud descends and speaks to Moses. And sometimes the cloud and Moses were there for a very long time, day after day, and sometimes it was only a short time. And when Moses came down from that mountain, having spoken with God, his face was radiant. People knew he'd been with God because his face was changed. Maybe a bit like Jesus' face was changed in this time of transfiguration. So the mountain and the cloud are symbols for the presence of God. And Jesus goes up the mountain with these 3 disciples, and a cloud descends. The picture is, this is where God is. So that's the first pair of symbols. The second pair of symbols we'll look at today, Moses and Elijah. I've already mentioned Moses once. Moses is the chief law giver. For Jewish people, that's the time that the 10 Commandments were given, and then the detailed working out of the law begins from that point. It's not detailed under Moses as it will become later on. But he is there as the lawgiver, the law given by God as a way of the covenant between humans and God. So he is there as a symbol of the law. Elijah is a prophet. Elijah was a person who spoke out against the way in which authorities at the time were not following God, the people were not following God, and he spoke out saying, this is what God requires, this is how you should behave, this is how you need to be in relationship with God. Moses and Elijah, the law and the prophets, on those two pillars are Judaism formed. Moses and Elijah appear with Jesus. All three of them are together. And they're talking about his departure for Jerusalem. Indeed, the words, I don't quite know why our translations don't use it, the word that Luke uses is the word exodus. So in other words, what Moses had taken his people through, so from Egypt to virtually to the Promised Land, Elijah and Moses are talking about Jesus' exodus, his departure for Jerusalem. And can you see the symbolism there? So just as Moses led God's people towards a promised land, so Jesus is going to take God's people to a new promised land. And it's as though they're sort of sending him on his way. This is what's got to happen. Whether he wants it or not, this is God's will. So it's as though this is a sort of fulfillment. Here is the law, here is the prophets. They're not to be thrown away, they're not to be discarded, but Jesus is the fulfillment. And he will now take God's people onto Jerusalem and then onto the promised land after that. So what happens at the Transfiguration? An enormous amount of symbolism and as I say, more than we can look at now. In addition to that, there's a sort of synergy with two other events, and events that happened before and events that happened afterwards. So previous to that, Jesus' baptism. Let me just read you these verses, or this verse. This is from the Transfiguration. So a cloud, while they were on the mountain, a cloud came down, and a voice came from the cloud saying, "This is my son whom I have chosen, listen to him." Does your mind flip back to Jesus' baptism? When he came out of the water, a voice said, "This is my son." The words are not exactly the same, but they are very, very similar. And when looking at this, I thought this is just shades of Jesus' baptism, a similar occurrence, a clear voice from God proclaiming who Jesus is and the relationship between God and Jesus. And in a similar way, but this time going further forward, so looking ahead to the Garden of Gethsemane, I thought there were a number of things here that were really quite similar. So Jesus took with him Peter, James and John to pray. Now here it's a mountain, Gethsemane, it's obviously a garden, but he takes the people who are very close to him to pray with him. In Gethsemane, we remember that they couldn't stay awake. They kept nodding off, however much they wanted to stay awake. There was nothing they could do and kept nodding off. Whereas here it's the other way around. Peter and his companions were very sleepy, but when they became fully awake, they saw Moses and Elijah and they were off. So I thought that here is a sort of an event that maybe brings together those three important occasions in Jesus' life. The time of his baptism, when God affirmed who Jesus was and sent him off on his ministry, the time of transformation, when God affirms who Jesus is and sends him off to Jerusalem, and the time in Gethsemane when there's no voice, but Jesus is there praying with his friends who are mostly sleeping, but seeking God's will. You know, that's the time when he said, I know this is what I've got to do. I really, really don't want to do it, but this is what I have to do. So we've seen when it happened, and we've seen what happened, or some of what happened. The last question I just want to look with you for a short time. Why did it happen? Why did it happen? Why was it necessary? Two reasons I want to suggest to you. First of all, and I think I think the most important reason in my reading of this is that this is reassurance for Jesus. Now, we know that Jesus was God, and we know that Jesus was a human as well. But I wonder whether we've actually stopped to think that sometimes Jesus was uncertain. So in this curious balance of being God and all the power that comes with being God, but being limited because he was also a human, were there times when Jesus was uncertain, unsure, wanted reassurance? And I wonder whether at the time of his baptism, from then he went onto all of his ministry, and here, as he looks towards Jerusalem and everything that was going to hold, the betrayal of his friends, all of his friends disappearing at the time of crucifixion, the enormous physical pain that was coming, and much, much more than that, the spiritual pain of separation from his Father. This is a time that Jesus needed reassurance from God. This is the right thing to be doing. And in order to do that, the cloud comes down, the voice is spoken, and God said, "This is my son whom I have chosen. Listen to him." Listen to him. We've just had Elijah there. Elijah's there, great prophet. We've got Moses. We've got the great law. And God is saying, listen to Jesus over and above all the prophets and over the law. Listen to him. Reassurance for Jesus at this crucial point as he turns and he heads to a place he does not want to go. Is this right? And God says, this is my son. This is the right way to go. And then also, and this is something that we're going to build on in just a moment, I wonder whether this is also a lesson for the disciples who are there as well. The disciples who've been living with Jesus for some significant length of time, they've seen the wonderful things that he's done, but they've lived with him very much as a human. You know, they've looked for food together, they've shared hospitality together, they've seen when Jesus has been hungry, they've seen when Jesus has been tired, they've seen when he's felt overwhelmed perhaps by the demands being put on him by people in the crowd. And here is a lesson for the disciples. Jesus is indeed human, does indeed relate to everything that we go through, but Jesus is God, and therefore different, and therefore holy, and therefore other. And so here the disciples see that this man that they've been sharing the last months, years with, who is extraordinary, does all these amazing things, this cloud comes down, this is God, and says, "This is my son." So maybe this was also a message for the disciples. Jesus is not just a wonderful miracle worker. Jesus is not just a fantastic teacher. Jesus is more than any of that. In his essence, Jesus is God. And therefore, all of that picture shows us God in his glory. And the glory that we see here, the glory that we see at other times, will ultimately, John's Gospel tells us, will ultimately be seen when Jesus is crucified. The greatest glory is at the time of crucifixion. So I want to pick up on that idea of God's glory and explore it with you just for a short while, because I don't know about you, but that's an aspect of God's character that I can often let slide. I'm so caught up with the fact that Jesus is like us, the Holy Spirit is with us and so forth. God's glory tends to sort of sit on one side sometimes. So just for a moment or two, if we can try and put other things to one side, I do understand that often that's very difficult. I'm going to read to you a section from this book, which is somebody who did a tour of the Holy Land. We're going to listen to a piece of music, and then I'm going to say a prayer. So this is from a book called God's Springtime by Joyce Huggett. I once climbed the Mount of Transfiguration, and as I sat in the sun on the plateau where it is believed Jesus was transfigured, I tried to imagine the disciples witnessing Jesus resplendent in glory, and how I might have felt if I had been privileged to be there. I wandered into the chapel which has been built on that mountaintop, and I was acutely aware that this was holy ground, a place where people became lost in wonder, love, and praise. A place where people struggled to express the depth of their devotion to God. Even the God-given gift of the imagination affords us only a hint of the wonder the disciples witnessed on that mountain. But the reality of God is not hidden from us. As Isaiah reminds us, the whole earth is full of his glory. There, that day, on the Mount of Transfiguration, the world seemed not simply full, but overflowing with God's glory. I saw it in the deep blue of the sky. I felt it in the warmth of the sun. I heard it in the praises of the pilgrims. I sensed it in the grandeur of the mountains. I touched it in the blades of the grass and in the wild flowers. On that memorable day, I realized that the whole earth is full of that which enables us to know God with a heart knowledge which prompts us to worship him, delight in him, and to joy in God for his own sake. So I invite you to sit, to listen, to shut your eyes, to do whatever makes you comfortable. And we're going to listen just to the beginning of Vivaldi's Gloria, a piece of music that takes us beyond where we are now, with just a hint, just a glimpse of that glory of God.